Hello everyone, it's Alexander Platt here again from the LSO. I'm so looking forward to sharing with you tonight an intimate, beautiful holiday bouquet of gems from the classical music repertoire for string orchestra that will, I hope, bring to you a sense of oh so badly needed warmth and joy in this very challenging holiday season. I, of course, hope that you are all well and staying safe. And again, we can't share in this music literally together, but through the miracle of live stream, at least virtually, we can send this music to you across the airwaves. I once again want to thank Eva Marie Restel, our executive director, and our incredibly intrepid and generous board of directors in keeping these performances going all season. As you know, there's much reason to hope for better days ahead, and we so much hope that when spring does come to the Cooley region, we'll be able to join you live on stage with our full Lacrosse Symphony Orchestra. But this week, of course, we must still be careful. But again, we are so blessed by your generosity in Lacrosse to keep the music playing, and in this safe and socially distanced manner, a small chamber orchestra of 15 of our finest musicians will present this program with me for you tonight. As I said, we have gathered together a beautiful bouquet of musical flowers that I hope evoke for you the holiday spirit, music of both sacred and secular heritage for this evening. We're going to start, I think appropriately, with a joyous and brisk little Fantasia on a little English folk song that has become one of the most beloved Christmas carols for almost 2 centuries now. I think you've guessed by now that I'm referring to the Old English carol Greensleeves, which actually originated as a very bawdy love song in 17th century England. However, by the mid-19th century, it had become a beloved Christmas carol set to several texts. The most popular of them is, of course, the tune, "What Child Is This?" And like several of the pieces of music you're going to hear tonight, it is in a kind of triple time, as it were, this da-da-dee, da-dee, da-da, a kind of a, what I think we'd call a lullaby meter, really, or rhythm, I should say. And, but however, at various speeds. This one, of course, is very fast because it's the treatment of Greensleeves by one of the great English composers of the earlier 20th century, Gustav Holst. Now, you probably know Holst because he wrote that mammoth orchestral masterpiece. It is truly a masterpiece. Of course, his set of musical fantasias on the planets, and it is a work scored, of course, for very large, very large symphony orchestra. But this is Holst at his most intimate, because this is the finale of his so-called St. Paul's Suite for string orchestra. The St. Paul's Suite, like The Planets, a work from a similar time but could not be more different. This also dates from the years around World War I. I think he started it in 1913 or so, but it wasn't published until 1922. The St. Paul's in the title refers to the St. Paul's School for Girls, where Holst was the music master for many years. It was a job that was very, very important to him because Holst was of a very shy and retiring nature, a brilliant man, a genius musician, and a true a person of wide-ranging musical interests, along with the folk songs of the British Isles, which he collected in his early days with his good friend, that other great English composer, Ralph Vaughn Williams. Along with folk songs of the British Isles, Holst's other passion was the music and the literature and the culture of India, which of course at that time was still a colony, a grand colony, of course, in the then sprawling British Empire. And like many British intellectuals, he developed a great love for India and its vast and mysterious culture. So Holst, at the same time, is this great, joyous and jaunty English nationalist composer, and yet there's this very serene sense, this very mystical sense. He was in many ways, I think, a kind of musical mystic. And you get those two personalities intertwined in this, it was universally noted, this kind of very gentle, shy, retiring man. Actually, it should be noted that his daughter, Imogen Holst, was not only also a great and gifted musician. She was not a composer, but she made her name for time immemorial as the great assistant, what we call the amanuensis to the great British composer of the middle 20th century, Benjamin Britten. So this was a great musical lineage indeed. The finale of this little St. Paul's Suite that Holst wrote for the string orchestra at the St. Paul's School for Girls is a, again, brilliant little, very jaunty little juxtaposition of two beloved ancient British Isles folk songs. The first one that you'll hear is a tune called the Dargason, which vaguely means like it was an Irish term for kind of a sea monster. You know, in Scotland they have the Loch Ness Monster. Well, in Irish folk culture they have the Dargason, and this actually became a kind of a military folk song. And that gets developed brilliantly by Holst. And then he adds over it the beautiful, again, the jaunty and the serene, the serenity of Greensleeves. And it's all brilliantly whipped together to a froth and has a strange, quirky little conclusion. We will then play the other equally immortal classical music treatment of the Greensleeves tune by, as I mentioned just a minute ago, Gustav Holst's great and dear friend and one of the other great British composers of the early 20th century, Ralph, or if you want to be fancy, Rafe Vaughn Williams. Now, Vaughn Williams, of course, left the world 9 great symphonies, several of which I so much hope that I can share with you in live performance with the La Crosse Symphony. Vaughn Williams, in his 9 symphonies, I see him rather like the Antonin Dvorak of the 20th century symphony. Kind of as Dvorak celebrated his Czech heritage, of course, in every note of every page of his music, so was Vaughn Williams kind of a nationalistic English composer, but I know he would not like that term because Vaughn Williams was very much a man of pacifist leanings. He was a conscientious objector in World War I. Like Ravel, he drove an ambulance during the war. And he came from another very interesting man, was one of the very few great composers of the classical music tradition to actually, this is very rare among composers, he was actually born into very comfortable circumstances. Actually, he was a direct descendant of Charles Darwin. So it was, as they'd say, a landed English family, landed gentry. So Vaughn Williams did not have to write music necessarily for money, but despite that, he was incredibly prolific. And again, over a very long life and a very long career, left the world dozens and dozens of works, well over 100 full set works, but again, including these 9 symphonies, several of which are absolutely magnificent, and I hope so much to do for you sometime. One of his miniature works that has always been very well known is, of course, his Fantasia, as he calls it on the title page, his Fantasia on Greensleeves. This is also one that celebrates the secular as well as sacred traditions of this tune. He also, as Holst did, juxtaposes it with another British Isles folk song, one of completely secular nature called Lovely Joan. This whole little Fantasia for chamber orchestra was actually drawn from an opera Vaughn Williams wrote called Sir John in Love, kind of a Shakespearean themed English opera. Vaughn Williams had obviously a lot of fun writing his 9 symphonies, but like many a great composer, his great dream was to find success on the operatic stage. And he wanted to prove to the world that not just the Germans and the French and the Italians, but the English could even produce great romantic operas. Well, as much as I love Vaughan Williams's symphonies, I have to say that his operas are not ultimately a great success, but they have their moments, and this Fantasia on green sleeves is certainly one of them. It's a work, again, with mostly secular derivations, but it has come down to us by this stage of the game as very much a sacred work, a kind of a sacred Christmas carol without words, if you will. Vaughan Williams, through his majestic sense of orchestration, even on this intimate chamber music scale, Vaughan Williams proves himself to be one of the great, great masters of orchestration, like, say, Richard Strauss or Maurice Ravel. The way he voices everything is so, so perfect. And of course, he makes absolutely beautiful, poignant use of the harp in this beautiful little musical gem, his Fantasia on green sleeves. Well, we then go to another beautiful Christmas gem, which is also based in this dance-like meter, this da-da-dee-da-dum. What this really is deep down is something we call a Siciliano, which is that word in Italian would suggest from Sicily. The Siciliano is an ancient Sicilian peasant dance, which always is in 6/8 or 12/8 time. So again, this da da dee da 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 da. And this kind of tune became incredibly popular in the Baroque era in the 18th century when, as I think you know by now, if you've listened to me go on about music, in the 18th century, all of European culture still looked to Italy. All roads still led to Rome. And this really went on until, gosh, early to mid-19th century France, when painters would still, in their youthful years, would still take a stagecoach or even walk to Italy to do what was called the Grand Tour, to see the ruins of ancient Rome and derive inspiration for their painting, their music, their poetry, their literature. Anyway, so in the Baroque era in the 18th century, all roads really did lead back to Italy and to Rome, most specifically, and also Venice, of course. But it was the young George Frederick Handel who, it sounds like a joke when you say it, but George Frederick Handel, who was an exact contemporary of Johann Sebastian Bach, was literally the greatest German composer to write Italian music in England. Born in Germany, North Germany, in Halle. He could have remained in Germany like J.S. Bach did and become a great musician of the church, as dear old Johann Sebastian so magnificently became. Handel was a man of much more secular leanings, shall we say, and when he was young enough to make the trip, he did beat a path to Rome, where he was quickly accepted into the how does one say it, the very sophisticated, rather decadent Roman papal court of the day. And he spent his youth there, where he encountered the music of great Italian Baroque composers of the previous generation, like Arcangelo Corelli and Antonio Vivaldi. Of course, Vivaldi was up in Venice, but it was Corelli who was down in Rome, and I'm mentioning this because I'll get to him later. But after Handel's apprenticeship years in Italy, he went to England. He moved to London, where, of course, he became the greatest, the most popular operatic and oratorio composer of his time. Well, it was in 1741, and again, it really is true, that Handel wrote his by far most famous masterpiece, one of the most famous works of classical music of all time, his oratorio, Messiah. It was in 1741 that it really is true. He wrote this gigantic, sprawling masterpiece for soloists, choir, and orchestra on biblical, generally speaking, on biblical texts. He wrote the whole thing in 24 days. It really is a miracle. It's a work not without controversy, but of course, any great work of art, that engages the mind as well as the soul, has its controversial aspects. And I think enough said on that topic, but it remains this sprawling and beloved masterpiece of sacred music. As you probably know, Messiah spans the entire journey of the Christian story, from Advent, Christmas, then through Lent, and then Easter. Part one, Messiah is a work in three parts, of course. Part one is what we have always referred to as the Christmas portion, because that is the part of the Christian epic that it deals with. It is the Christmas story based on the Gospels. And the work we now know and love as the Pastoral Symphony is nothing more or less than an Italian Siciliana, the kind of music that the young Handel would have heard in his youthful days in Rome, and that dee da 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 da. And it has been, well, a few years after its premiere in 1742, of course, which was in Dublin, which was at that point also, like India, basically a colony in the British Empire. Soon after its performance in Dublin, this little movement for the orchestra alone was dubbed the Pastoral Symphony, and that's because of where it occurs right in the middle of part one. And it is obviously a musical evocation without words by Handel of, as it is said in Scripture, the shepherds abiding in the field, tending to their flocks by night. Handel's own title in the manuscript is also very interesting. He simply, in his haste, because again, he wrote this sprawling masterpiece in 24 days, he wrote in a little Italian word, piffa, and that's short for pifferari, which are the bagpipes of Italian music. Of course, we always think only Scotland has bagpipes in their traditional folk culture, but not only in the British Isles, but in northern France, all the Celtic peoples, northern France, the Celtic part of northern Spain, and also in Italy and Sicily, bagpipes, and Greece also. Bagpipes are part of the traditional folk music culture. So the pifferari are the Italian version of the bagpipes, which for some reason, I think I would very much like to hear those more than Scottish bagpipes. But I can say that because I'm both Scottish and Italian in my background. But it's a wonderful idea, Italian bagpipes. So this is what Handel is trying to evoke. They are shepherds abiding in the field, but they are Italian or Sicilian shepherds, so they play the pifferari. And in that tradition of what in Baroque music is called a pastoral, the music is always in this Siciliano rhythm, so it's in 6/8 or 12/8, that's dee da da da. And also the melody is played, it's two voices playing in thirds. It's two or three voices, and everything is running along in thirds. So it's very inherently harmonious and gentle. And this became a very favorite little musical form in the Baroque era. And this, again, the Pastoral Symphony from Handel's Messiah, is one of the most enduringly beautiful and serene examples. We then go to, well, not quite the serenity, but the deep, the wistful and winsome melancholy of Norway's greatest composer, Norway's greatest musical son. Of course, I'm referring to Edvard Grieg, the great voice of the Norwegian people. As you know, I did my apprenticeship years as a conductor in the Twin Cities, and for 2 or 3 years, I was the conductor of a real kind of a neighborhood community orchestra on the south side of Minneapolis. And there was a lovely older lady who was the one person who played the double bass, because in community orchestras, not a lot of people want to lug a double bass every Monday night to a rehearsal room. But with this lovely older Norwegian lady and her older Norwegian husband who would accompany her, and they would take their break together. They would have their coffee during the break. And they were I'll never forget this adorable old Norwegian couple. And we were doing a piece by Grieg. We were doing one of the Peer Gynt suites, of course. And this wonderful older lady said to me, she just said, without guile, she said, Grieg is the voice of the Norwegian people. And that sounds very kind of cute and Garrison Keillor-ish, but I really took that to heart. And when I've gone through later on, since then, I've gone through a couple of very difficult times in my life, like when I lost my mother. I think of Grieg's music, even though I'm not myself Norwegian at all, because his music does have this incredibly winsome quality, this very special kind of melancholy that I think is part of Norwegian music and the Norwegian personality even. We're going to perform two of the beloved, the cherished lyric pieces of Grieg that Grieg wrote, like Felix Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, which were obviously his model. Grieg wrote the lyric pieces in several books and several volumes over the entire course of his life, and this music became so popular. How do I say this? Like, if you went to a residential neighborhood in La Crosse in the 1920s or even the 1950s, of course, there would be a piano in the living room, maybe just an upright or maybe a baby grand, but there would be a piano. And if you opened the piano bench, I can assure you, you would find at least one of the volumes of Edvard Grieg's lyric pieces. Everyone knew these pieces, everyone played these pieces. Of course, this was a time in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries when knowing how to play the piano was just an essential requirement of middle-class life. So everyone knew, and they could play the easier ones of the Grieg lyric pieces. By the late 19th century, these works had become indescribably popular the world over. And so many of Grieg's colleagues and fans begged him to orchestrate them, to arrange them for symphony orchestra. And the first of the two lyric pieces that we're going to share with you tonight, called The Shepherd Boy, is actually the first movement of something that was eventually called the Lyric Suite. It was originally orchestrated by Anton Seidl, great German bohemian conductor who was most famously the music director of the New York Philharmonic. It was Anton Seidl who gave the very first performance at Carnegie Hall of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Shortly before then, he had begged Grieg to orchestrate his lyric pieces, and Grieg, much like Claude Debussy, hated to orchestrate, so he wouldn't do it. So Anton Seidl, you know what, in these days, back then, when you didn't have Google and you could have skirt copyright issues, he, across the Atlantic in New York, he made his own orchestration. He put together half a dozen works from the lyric pieces and orchestrated them, and called them a lyric suite. Grieg heard about it, saw the score, and was actually a real gentleman and said, well, I like this, but I can make a few changes. And it was eventually published under Grieg's name completely as the lyric suite. The first movement of that suite is the work you're going to hear now. This really heartbreaking little piece for harp and strings called The Shepherd Boy. And again, this is what people did before telephones and the internet. This is the shepherd boy who has to go out for months on end, out in the middle of nowhere to tend to the flock. And it's about his intense loneliness. And it's a loneliness that really so many of us feel, especially at Christmas time. The second of the two lyric pieces is from a different volume. And this is actually from two little pieces for string orchestra. Grieg arranged them himself just for strings. And it's called, again, apropos of Christmas, this is a little song, a little piece called At the Cradle. We will also, speaking of the cradle, present one of the great holiday Christmas time works, especially beloved by children, the Overture to Tchaikovsky's Christmas ballet, The Nutcracker, which, unlike most of Tchaikovsky's works, was very popular from the moment its inception. However, as a full ballet, it was not until the 1950s when it was revived in a production by George Balanchine at the New York City Ballet that it became the kind of essential holiday ballet that, of course, it now is the world over. Now, as you know, the Overture to the Nutcracker is scored for almost full orchestra. And tonight we will present it to you in a very clever and charming arrangement for string orchestra alone. We'll go back to the music of Edvard Grieg for what I feel is his greatest and most substantial work, along with the evergreen Piano Concerto in A minor. I think you know I'm referring to the Holberg Suite for string orchestra. It was a work written in 1884, again, like most pieces by Grieg, written for solo piano, but a work of such richness and invention that he himself, just a year later, made the decision to arrange it for string orchestra. The 5-movement suite, which again has nothing, in this case, is a work that has nothing to do with Christmas, but has a wonderful quality that I think, as you'll see and hear, fits perfectly into the more joyous aspects of the holiday spirit. It is a suite in 5 movements that is in a conscious evocation of the style of the Baroque of the 18th century. And of course, Grieg is writing this in the late 19th century, but it's one of the first works of the late Romantic era to actually look backwards, not forwards like all those Wagner operas, but look backwards to the music and the style of the 18th century. It's called the Holberg Suite because, again, speaking of the 18th century, the work was written as a tribute to Ludwig Holberg, who was really what to Danish Norwegian culture is, say, what Jean-Jacques Rousseau is to the French Enlightenment. He was this great writer, novelist, philosopher, this great humanist, and he is beloved in Scandinavia as the French love Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the other great figures of the French Enlightenment. So Grieg wrote this as a tribute to this Scandinavian, this Nordic tradition of humanism and the Enlightenment. And again, it is a work totally evocative of the 18th century. And in this case, it does not evoke Italian music like Handel's Pastoral Symphony, but rather evokes the Baroque music of France, another of along with Italy, the other great tradition. And we must always remember that a composer like Johann Sebastian Bach, while he was the ultimate North German Lutheran church composer, throughout his life drew, for his own inspiration, drew on models from Italy and from France. So, like Bach, Grieg here writes a 5-movement suite in the French style. There's a preludium, very jaunty and joyous prelude. There's a sarabande, slow and melancholy. A very, especially jaunty gavotte, which is one of the courtly dances. A really, not melancholy, but really tragic air. And it all wraps up with, again, one of the quicker and jovial of the French Baroque dances, a rigadoon, which gives an opportunity for our concertmaster and principal viola to have a truly virtuoso star turn. It's, if so much of Grieg's music can be described as having that winsome, melancholy air, the Holberg Suite of Grieg is one of the most joyous works I know, and I hope it will give you a needed lift this holiday season. We will end in a sense of reverie and wonder with the little work on which Handel's Pastoral Symphony must surely have been based, the Pastorale, again, a Siciliano, a lullaby, if you will, the Pastorale from the very end of the so-called Christmas Concerto by Arcangelo Corelli, who was one of those great early Baroque era masters living and working in Rome. Corelli was a composer whose music the young Handel, while in Rome, absolutely, unequivocally knew very well. So here again, here is the original, here is the Rosetta Stone, if you will, of this great Baroque tradition of the Siciliano. May it bring joy and serenity and comfort to us all.